The noise of a busy elementary school cafeteria is nothing compared to the sound of a Black Hawk going down in hostile territory. Lena Marsh knew both. Most of the staff at Birchwood Elementary had no idea who the new lunchroom aide really was. They saw what she let them see. A quiet woman in her early 30s, with a plain ponytail and secondhand sneakers, the kind of person whose name you forgot the moment she left the room. She refilled chocolate milk cartons and wiped ketchup off tables and said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," to every teacher who spoke to her like she was furniture. Principal Denise Holbrook spoke to her that way, a lot. Lena had been at Birchwood for 6 weeks when Principal Holbrook stopped her in the hallway near the supply closet and told her, in a voice she didn't bother lowering, that the lunch trays had been stacked incorrectly, and that it wasn't a complicated task, and perhaps Lena wasn't suited to the demands of the position. 3 other teachers heard it. One of them, a second-grade teacher named Mr. Finch, looked at the floor. The other 2 kept walking. Lena said, "You're right, I'll fix it." She fixed it. She went back to the cafeteria, and she thought about the desert. And she thought about things she would never say in an elementary school hallway, and she stacked the trays exactly the way Principal Holbrook wanted them. She had learned a long time ago that the people who needed to be loudest about their authority were usually the most afraid. She'd spent 11 years confirming that theory in places most people couldn't find on a map. Lena Marsh had enlisted at 19, been selected for the 75th Ranger Regiment at 22, and quietly transferred into a special mission unit before she turned 25. She'd done 4 deployments, run point on extractions in 3 different countries, and once talked a wounded teammate through an improvised tourniquet application while she herself was bleeding from a through and through in her left shoulder. She had commendations she couldn't talk about and a classified service record that took up considerably more space than her personnel file suggested. She'd gotten out 14 months ago, not because she had to, because she'd watched her closest friend, a woman named Torres, get medically discharged after a training accident and come home alone and spiral quietly in a way that no one inside the unit seemed to notice. Lena noticed. She got out to be nearby, took the first civilian job she could find that didn't require explaining her resume, and spent her weekends driving Torres to physical therapy appointments. Working in a school cafeteria had not been part of any plan, but it was close to Torres's apartment, the hours fit, and Lena found she didn't mind the kids. They were honest. They told you exactly what they thought. The sandwiches were bad and the corn was mushy. And sometimes someone's mom had packed them a Lunchable, and they'd sit with the Lunchable like it was a crown jewel, and Lena appreciated that kind of uncomplicated joy. She was thinking about this, about a first grader named Marcus, who had showed her his Lunchable turkey stacks with the gravity of someone presenting scientific findings when it happened. It was a Tuesday in November, 11:14 in the morning, and the cafeteria was at maximum capacity. The first thing Lena heard was the side door, not knocked open, not swung, kicked, a single deliberate impact that came off the metal frame like a gunshot, and Lena was already moving before the sound had fully registered in anyone else's ears, stepping sideways toward the serving counter without running, without drawing attention, every nerve in her body cataloging exits and sightlines and the position of the 400 small human beings currently eating lunch. The man who came through the door was in his 40s, heavy, wearing a gray jacket that was too warm for November in the way that said he was carrying something underneath it. He had the posture of someone who had rehearsed this and the eyes of someone who was already past the point where rehearsal felt real. Lena recognized both immediately. She had stood across from people like this. She had been trained to read them in the 3 seconds before everything went sideways. The calculus ran automatically, the way breathing did. One subject visible, gray jacket, left side weighted, emotional dysregulation but not erratic, has a specific objective, not random. Looking for someone or something, moving toward the interior, not the exits. His name, she would learn later, was Dennis Prawl. He was the father of a second-grade student named Callie. He had been in a custody dispute that had ended badly and then gotten worse, and he had arrived at Birchwood Elementary with a legally purchased handgun and 11 years of accumulated grievance and a plan that had made sense to him at 6 o'clock that morning, and was starting to make less sense now that he was standing in the cafeteria of his daughter's school, surrounded by children eating corn dogs. Lena did not know any of that yet. What she knew was the side door, the jacket, the weight distribution, and the 400 kids. She moved. She didn't run toward him. That was a mistake people made. Instinct drove them straight at the threat when the threat was a person, but Lena's training had long ago replaced instinct with something more precise. She angled left, putting herself between Prahl and the nearest cluster of kids, a table of third graders who were so absorbed in an argument about which superhero would win in a fight that they hadn't looked up yet. She kept her body language loose, non-threatening, just a cafeteria aide walking to the next station. Prahl had stopped in the center of the room. The cafeteria had gone quiet. The way rooms went quiet when something was wrong, but no one was sure yet what. A few of the older kids had noticed him. A teacher near the back wall, Ms. Terrence, had her hand on her phone. Nobody move. His voice came out louder than he'd planned. He flinched slightly at the sound of it. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I need to see my daughter. The silence turned into something else. A first grader started crying. Then two. Then a sound moved through the room like wind before a storm. The sound of 200 kids realizing simultaneously that something was very, very wrong. Principal Holbrook appeared at the cafeteria entrance. Lena had to give her this. She didn't run. She stood in the doorway with her mouth slightly open and her hands clutched in front of her, and she said, "Sir, please." And Prahl turned toward her voice, and his hand moved toward the left side of his jacket. Lena covered the distance between herself and Prahl in under 2 seconds. She came in low and from his right, the side he wasn't guarding, and she had his right wrist trapped and his body off balance before he'd fully processed that she was there. She didn't fight him. Fighting took time and made noise and scared children. She redirected him, used his own momentum and the sudden physics of a body being moved in a direction it didn't expect, and walked him forward 2 steps into the serving counter, hard enough to pin, not hard enough to injure. His left hand came up, and she caught it at the wrist before it reached the jacket. "I need you to stop," she said, very quietly, directly into his ear. "Your daughter is in this building, and I need you to stop right now." Something in the word daughter landed on him differently than everything else had. She felt the resistance go out of his arms like air from a punctured tire. Not surrender, exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying something too heavy for too long and finally setting it down somewhere, even if the somewhere was wrong. "I just want to see her," he said. His voice had changed. He sounded like someone waking up. "I know," Lena said. "But not like this." She held him there against the counter, his arms secured, while she looked at Miss Terrence across the room and made a small, controlled nod toward the door. Miss Terrence had her phone to her ear already. "Good." Lena met the eyes of Mr. Finch, the second-grade teacher who had looked at the floor when Holbrook dressed her down in the hallway, and she said calmly, "Can you get the kids to the gym, please? Use the north doors. Take everyone." Finch moved. He moved fast and he moved well, and he started speaking to the kids in the low, steady voice you used when you needed compliance without panic, and the other teachers picked it up, and the room began to empty in organized clusters. The older kids guiding the younger ones, someone's sneakers squeaking on the cafeteria floor, and within 4 minutes the room held only Lena, Prahl, Principal Holbrook frozen in the doorway, and a first grader who had fallen asleep under a table and woke up confused. The police arrived at 11:22. Lena walked out of the cafeteria 11 minutes after she'd walked in, her shirt untucked on one side, a red mark developing on her left forearm where Prahl's watch face had caught her when she'd redirected his wrist. She found the kids in the gym. She found Marcus, the lunchable kid, sitting with his back against the bleachers and his knees pulled to his chest, and she sat down next to him on the floor without saying anything, and after a moment he leaned against her arm. "Are we safe now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "How do you know?" She thought about it. "Because I made sure," she said. The police interviews took the rest of the afternoon. Lena gave her account to a detective named Okafor, who had a careful way of asking questions, the kind where he was listening for what you left out as much as what you included. She answered him completely and left nothing out and watched him reassess what he was looking at in real time. He asked her how she'd known to move when she did. She told him she'd noticed the door and the jacket. He asked how she'd known how to disarm someone like that. She told him she'd had some training. He waited for more. She didn't offer more. Detective Okafor looked at her for a long moment and then wrote something in his notebook that she didn't ask to see. Principal Holbrook found her in the parking lot at 4:15. Lena was sitting on the hood of her car eating a granola bar because she hadn't eaten since 7, and her body was beginning to make its opinions known. Holbrook walked across the parking lot with the energy of a woman who had prepared what she was going to say and was committed to saying it regardless of circumstances. "I wanted to speak with you," Holbrook said. "Okay. What you did in there?" She paused. Rearranged whatever she had planned. I don't understand how a cafeteria aide." She stopped again. Started over. "You could have been killed. You understand that?" "Yes," Lena said. "You put yourself." Holbrook's voice caught on something. "Those are my kids in there. Those are my kids and you." She pressed her lips together. "I don't understand who you are." Lena finished the granola bar. She folded the wrapper precisely in half, the way she folded everything, a habit so deeply ingrained by 11 years of fieldwork that she did it without thinking. She looked at Holbrook, and she thought about the hallway near the supply closet and the wrong way to stack trays and the voice that hadn't bothered to be quiet. "I'm the cafeteria aide," Lena said. "I'll see you tomorrow." She drove home. She called Torres. Torres asked how her day was, and Lena said, "Fine, weird, tell me about physical therapy." And Torres told her about the new exercises and the PT who kept playing Fleetwood Mac during sessions, and Lena sat on her couch in the dark and ate a bowl of cereal and breathed slowly and let her heart rate finish coming down. The next morning, the story was on the local news. It was the morning after that when they showed up. Lena was in the school parking lot at 7:46, earlier than usual, because the children would come back today, for the first time since Tuesday, and she wanted to be there when they arrived. She had a thermos of coffee, and she was thinking about Marcus, and whether he'd slept okay, and whether she should bring something. Donuts, maybe. The kind with the sprinkles that first graders treated like currency. She was thinking about sprinkled donuts when the black SUV pulled into the lot. Then the second one. Then a third. They parked in a careful formation, the kind that wasn't accidental, and the doors opened, and 7 people got out, and Lena stood very still next to her car with the thermos in her hand, and she looked at the people. And the people looked at her. She knew 3 of them. The woman in front was Major Claire Donaldson, who had run the operational planning cell for Lena's last 2 deployments, and who had, on one occasion, flown 14 hours to pull Lena out of a situation that had gone sideways in a way that wasn't in any after-action report. Donaldson was in civilian clothes, but she stood like she was in uniform because she always stood like she was in uniform. Behind her left shoulder was Staff Sergeant Pete Ruiz, who Lena had trained with for 8 months, and who made the worst coffee she had ever tasted in her life, and who had once, in a compound in the dark with bad intel and worse visibility, stayed on comms with her for 3 hours, straight talking about absolutely nothing, just so she wouldn't be alone in the silence. And in the back, taller than everyone around him, was Command Sergeant Major David Ferris. Retired now, like her. But he carried retirement the same way he carried everything, like it was temporary, and he was simply waiting for what came next. Lena hadn't spoken to any of them in 14 months. Donaldson crossed the parking lot and stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment the way she always looked at people. Like she was reading a document and making sure she hadn't missed anything. "I told you," Donaldson said, "that you were too good to stack trays." Lena said, "The trays needed stacking." Something moved across Donaldson's face. Not a smile exactly. Something more internal than that. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a folded piece of paper and held it out. Lena took it. It was a drawing, crayon on torn notebook paper, done in the style of someone who was approximately 6 years old and extremely confident in their artistic abilities. It showed a figure with a brown ponytail and a blue shirt, standing between a large dark shape and a group of small people. The large dark shape had a red X through it. The small people had happy faces, Above the ponytailed figure, in block letters that had been written by an adult but in a child's chosen words, it read, "The Lady WO saved US." Below that, in messier handwriting, clearly the child's own, she was strong like a superhero, but she looked like a regular person. Lena looked at the drawing for a long time. Ruiz appeared at Donaldson's shoulder. "Callie Prawl drew it," he said. "The little girl whose dad, the school gave copies to the first responders. Someone who knew what to look for sent one to us." "She said you didn't run," Donaldson said. "She was hiding under a table and she said you didn't run. You walked. She said you walked like you weren't scared." "I was scared," Lena said. "I know," Donaldson said. "That's different from running." Ferris had come up behind them while they were talking. He was a man who had never in Lena's experience wasted words, and he didn't waste them now. He looked at her the way he had looked at her 11 years ago when she'd first come through selection, and 8 years ago when she'd come back from her first deployment, and 6 years ago when she'd been recommended for a commendation she'd tried to decline. "We have a request," he said, "from the families, the ones whose kids were in that cafeteria." He paused. "They want to meet you, formally. They've asked if you'd be willing." Lena thought about Marcus with his back against the bleachers. She thought about the first grader who had fallen asleep under the table. She thought about 200 children walking out the north doors with their sneakers squeaking on the cafeteria floor. "Okay," she said. "One more thing." Ferris reached into his jacket. He produced a small square box and held it out to her with both hands in the way that meant it wasn't a casual gesture, the way that meant he understood the weight of what he was holding. Lena recognized the box. She had seen ones like it before, though never opened one addressed to her. Because the one time she'd been recommended, she'd submitted the paperwork to decline before it was processed. "This one," Ferris said, "they didn't give you the option." Inside the box was a commendation she hadn't known was in progress. Awarded not by the military, she was no longer active, but through a channel that existed for exactly these situations. For people who carried their service in civilian life and kept doing the work without the designation. The language in the document was precise in the way military language always was, and it said, without flourish, that Sergeant First Class Lena Marsh had demonstrated exceptional composure under threat and materially contributed to the safety of 412 children and 47 adults. Lena read it twice. She looked up. Principal Holbrook was standing at the edge of the parking lot. She must have arrived during the past few minutes, drawn by the black SUVs, and she stood at the perimeter of the gathering with her hands at her sides and an expression that Lena could not fully read. Not the commanding hallway expression. Something stripped of the performance. Lena walked over to her. Holbrook looked at the box in her hands, and then at Lena's face, and then at the people in the parking lot, and something shifted in her expression in a way that suggested the rearrangement was significant. And not comfortable, and maybe overdue. "I didn't know," Holbrook said. "I know you didn't," Lena said. "I said things to you that were." She stopped. "It's fine. It's not, actually." Holbrook said it quietly, with more directness than Lena had heard from her before, the kind that cost something to produce. "It's not fine, and I'd like to apologize." Lena looked at her for a moment. "Accepted," she said. The kids began arriving at 8:15. They came off buses and out of cars, and through the front entrance with the cautious energy of children returning somewhere that had frightened them, testing the air the way animals tested it, checking the angles. Lena was at the cafeteria door. She had stopped for donuts, the sprinkle kind, 2 dozen, and she had them in a box on the serving counter. Marcus found her almost immediately. He walked into the cafeteria and stopped when he saw her and looked at her with the extremely serious expression he applied to all significant things, and then he crossed the room and stood in front of her and said, "You came back. I said I would," Lena said. "You didn't say you would." He thought about it. "No. But I knew anyway." She opened the donut box and let him pick first, the particular honor she had decided he'd earned. He selected a sprinkle donut with the deliberateness of a person making a consequential choice, and then he looked up at her with chocolate on his finger and said, completely unprompted, "My grandpa was in the army." "Yeah?" He said, "The bravest people are usually the quiet ones." Lena handed him a napkin. "Your grandpa," she said, "sounds pretty smart." By mid-morning, the cafeteria was running at full capacity. The trays were stacked correctly. The corn was still a little mushy, but the kids ate it anyway. The way kids ate things they complained about when they were hungry enough. The noise level returned to its ordinary, unreasonable pitch. And someone spilled a full carton of chocolate milk, and a kindergartner had a small crisis about a missing lunch bag that turned out to be in her own backpack the entire time. Lena refilled the milk cartons and wiped the tables and moved between the stations with the quiet economy of motion that had always looked to other people like ordinariness, but was something else. Something learned and maintained, the particular stillness of a person who had been trained to make nothing look like something. In the parking lot, the black SUVs were gone. In the cafeteria, between a table of arguing fourth graders and a kindergartner who had located her sandwich, Lena Marsh did her job. She had decided, a good one.